At a 4th of July cookout in my daughter's backyard, my son-in-law's stepfather grabbed my 9-year-old grandson by the arm, hard enough to leave 4 finger-shaped bruises, dragged him across the patio, and shoved his face down into the grass for talking back. My son-in-law's mother didn't even look up from her phone. I set down my paper plate, walked to my truck, and made one phone call. They thought I was just a retired harbor guy who smelled like diesel and fixed his own gutters. They had no idea what I used to do for a living. Before I get into it, if you're new here, this is Saltline Justice. Subscribe, and tell me in the comments what coastline you grew up on. I read every one of them. I'm 71. For 34 years I worked as a marine cargo surveyor and insurance fraud investigator out of the port of Coos Bay, contracted to 3 of the biggest underwriters on the West Coast. I've walked the holds of burned freighters, testified against smuggling rings, and put my signature on reports that sank men's entire fortunes. But to my daughter Rosalind's husband, Desmond, and especially to Desmond's stepfather, Garrick Thorne, I was just Rosalind's old man, the guy who drove a rusted Dodge and split his own firewood. I hadn't had my grandson Miles overnight in 4 months. Rosalind kept finding reasons: a cold, a soccer tournament, things are just busy. I'd mailed Miles a birthday card with a 20 tucked inside, and a photo of the tide pools behind my place, since he'd told me once he wanted to see a sea star up close. It came back 3 weeks later, unopened, returned to sender, scrawled across the front, in handwriting that wasn't Rosalind's. I never mentioned it to her. Some things you just carry. The cookout invite came the same way everything came those days. A group text, no warmth in it. BBQ Saturday. Miles keeps asking about Grandpa Ellis. I drove the coast road out to their place in Bandon, a new build with cedar siding, and a boat Garrick never took out. Paid for, I'd later learn, mostly by Garrick's chain of tire and brake shops stretched across 3 counties. I parked behind Garrick's dually and his wife Delphine's leased Cadillac, and almost laughed, because 22 years earlier, I'd helped an underwriter deny a claim on a man who ran the exact same kind of total loss scam Garrick would turn out to be running. Miles saw me from across the yard and ran full speed, nearly knocking me down. He smelled like sunscreen and cut grass. He was quieter than I remembered, and there was an old yellow-green bruise circling one wrist like a bracelet. Garrick came over holding a beer at 2 in the afternoon, thick-necked, sunburned, a gold watch he made sure caught the light. "Coos Bay boy comes ashore," he said, looking me over like a used trade-in. "Insurance, huh? Paperwork." He said the word like it tasted bad. "I built 4 shops from nothing, 40-some employees. You ever build anything, or just wrote reports about other men's boats?" My son-in-law Desmond stared at his plate. He drove a delivery route for a regional bakery, 11 years, steady and honest, and Garrick spent the whole afternoon grinding him down for it in front of everyone. "Rosalind married a bread truck," he said, loud enough for the whole patio. Delphine laughed without looking up. Rosalind smiled into her drink. I kept eating and watching, the way I used to watch a hull for the seam that didn't match the paperwork. Miles knocked over a bag of chips reaching for a soda. Nothing broke, nothing spilled far. Garrick's face changed anyway. "Get over here." Desmond opened his mouth, a small crack of resistance, and Garrick talked right over him. Miles crossed that patio with his shoulders climbing up around his ears, the exact way I'd watched grown men walk toward a claims adjuster who already knew they were lying. It took maybe 3 seconds. Garrick's hand closed around his upper arm, yanked him off his feet, and pressed his face into the lawn, holding him there while he counted to 5, in a voice meant for the whole yard to hear. A muffled sound, grass in his teeth when Garrick finally let go. Delphine didn't glance up from her phone. "He's fine. Kids bounce." Desmond half rose, then sat back down and picked up his fork. I have run that moment back 1,000 times since. I don't blame my son-in-law. I understand now what years under that roof does to a man. But in that second, the only thing keeping me in my chair was knowing that if I stood up wrong, Miles would pay for it later, when I wasn't there to see it happen. So I folded my napkin, said I needed to find the bathroom, and Garrick waved me off without looking at me. "Try not to get lost, old-timer." I locked the door, sat on the closed toilet lid, and dialed a number I hadn't used in 6 years. Coos County Sheriff's, Investigations. This is Marsh. Deputy Marsh. It's Ellis Van Doren. His voice changed instantly. Ellis? It's been years. Everything okay? I need a unit out to 1140 Driftline Court in Bandon. Witness to a felony assault of a minor, approximately 9 years old. Adult male, mid-50s, roughly 240 pounds. Been drinking. Child was slammed face down and held there. He's up and moving now, but he needs to be looked at. Jesus. On it. Address again? I gave it twice. One more thing, Rick. The man's name is Garrick Thorne. He owns the Thorne tire chain. 3, maybe 4 locations now. If the sheriff wants a heads-up call before it hits the scanner, make it. Copy that. We're rolling. I splashed water on my face, looked at the tired old man in the mirror, and thought, I'm sorry, Miles. I let this go on too long. I started recording video on my phone, held low against my hip, and walked back out onto the patio. Miles was back at the table, picking grass out of a plate of potato salad he wasn't eating. Garrick had already circled back to lecturing Desmond about baseball being for boys who'd never played a real contact sport in their lives, no offense. I kept my face still and kept filming. The doorbell rang 19 minutes later. 2 deputies, an EMT, and Rick Marsh himself, more gray at the temples than the last time I'd seen him. A man I'd trained on his very first insurance fraud case back when he still called me sir. Garrick stood up too fast. This is private property. What the hell is this? Marsh knelt beside Miles first. Hey bud, I'm Rick. My friend here's just gonna take a look at you, okay? Then he stood and turned to Garrick. We're responding to a report from a witness on this property of a felony assault on a minor. I need everybody to stay seated. Witness? What witness? Marsh looked at me. Sir, can you confirm what you reported? I set my napkin on the table. My name is Ellis Van Doren. I'm Miles's grandfather. About 20 minutes ago, right here on this patio, I watched Mr. Thorne grab my grandson by the arm, lift him off his feet, and hold his face down in the grass. My daughter's mother-in-law watched it happen and told him it was fine. I have it on video. Garrick's face went from sunburned to a deep, waxy red. You called the cops on me at my own house. Who the hell are you to take a kid's side over mine? Marsh's jaw tightened. This is Ellis Van Doren. 34 years as a marine cargo and fraud investigator for 3 of the largest underwriters on this coast. He trained half the fraud unit I work in, including me. When he tells me what he saw, I don't need to hear the rest of the sentence. Nobody said anything for a moment. Rosalind looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time in her life. The EMT straightened up from checking Miles. Grass abrasions, some swelling around the left orbital bone, and I don't love how he's favoring that wrist. I'd like to take him in and get it imaged. He's fine, Rosalind snapped. He doesn't need a hospital. Ma'am, that's not your call to make alone right now. Desmond stood up slowly, both hands flat on the table like he was bracing against a wave. Take him, he said. Take my son. I'm riding along. As the EMT walked Miles past me, my grandson reached out and grabbed 2 of my fingers. Grandpa, are you coming? Right behind you, I told him. Garrick Thorne was arrested in his own backyard at 4:52 that afternoon, spatula still in his other hand. Assault of a minor and reckless endangerment of a child. Delphine wasn't cuffed, but she got a long talk from a deputy about mandatory reporting and a promised follow-up from the county's child welfare office. At the hospital, imaging showed a hairline fracture in Miles's wrist and a mild concussion from how hard his face had been driven into the ground. Desmond sat in the hallway with his head in his hands, making a sound I don't think I'd ever heard a grown man make. Dad, he said. He'd started calling me that years ago and never stopped. How did you know to call it in like that? Who even are you? I'm still just your father-in-law, I told him. Everything else was just a job I used to have. I explained why I'd never talked about the work. I didn't want to be introduced at parties as the insurance guy who put people away. I wanted to be Ellis, who fixed his own truck and split his own wood. He asked why I'd let Garrick run his mouth for years without saying a word. Because people show you exactly who they are the moment they think you don't matter, I said. I was just waiting to see how far it would go. For what? I didn't know it'd be today, but I knew it'd be someday. Then he asked about his own mother, about Delphine looking at her phone instead of her grandson's face in the grass. "I can't unsee that," he said. "What do I do now?" I told him that part wasn't mine to decide, but the county was about to open a file, and he needed to figure out, right now, whose corner he was standing in, his son's or his stepfather's. He couldn't stand in both. He looked down the hall toward the pediatric ward for a long time. "His corner," he finally said. "We start there." The next morning I called an old friend, Priya Okonkwo Lin, a retired maritime attorney turned family law shark who stood 5'0" and had once made a federal judge apologize to a witness mid-cross. "Send me everything by Wednesday," she said. "I'll make this quick and expensive for him." Then I called Walt Ferris, a former state insurance fraud examiner I'd worked a dozen cases with. "I need to know if Thorn Tire's books are clean." Long pause. "Ellis, are we doing what I think we're doing? I'm just an old man asking a friend a professional question." He laughed. "You never lost it. Give me a week." I wasn't in any hurry. 34 years in that work teaches you one true thing. Men who put their hands on children, the way Garrick had, do not, generally, run clean books. There's always a second set of numbers, hiding under the first, if you know where to look. Miles came home from the hospital in a splint, and came home, for now, to my place, since Rosalind refused to leave Bandon, and had already lawyered up over parental alienation. He didn't sleep well that first week. He flinched at the sound of the back door. The first time he really smiled was the night he asked me if I used to be a spy. "No, buddy. I looked at numbers on ships and figured out who was lying." "That's kind of like a spy," he said, and thought about it seriously, before adding that maybe he wanted to do that job too, someday. 10 days later, Walt called back. Thorn Tire had been running a rebuilt title scheme across all 4 shops for the better part of 5 years, buying flood and wreck-totaled vehicles out of state cheap, quietly retitling them through a shell company registered in Delphine's maiden name, then reselling them to unsuspecting buyers as clean used cars, north of $1 million in unreported income, the kind of structured cash deposits that get a federal examiner's attention within a day of pulling the records. I sat on my back porch that evening, with my old retriever Skiff's chin on my knee, listening to Miles laugh at something on TV inside, while Desmond talked to Priya on the phone about emergency custody. I felt no joy in it. I felt the same flat, settled quiet you feel when you finally find the leak that's been dripping in the wall for months. You don't celebrate that. You just stop hearing the drip. The criminal case moved fast. My video, the medical records, Miles's forensic interview. 6 weeks after that 4th of July, Garrick got a letter from the State Department of Revenue opening a fraud investigation. 3 days after that, the DMV suspended all 4 dealer licenses. His floor plan financing collapsed within the week, since the license suspension broke his loan terms. In under a month, he went from a man out on bail to a man with his entire business in receivership. He called Desmond screaming that his own father had done this to him. Desmond said, quietly, "You're not my father, Garrick," and hung up. Rosalind filed for divorce that fall, expecting an easy split. Instead, she got Priya, 31 exhibits deep. Medical charts, the police report, sworn statements from 2 former shop employees about the paperwork games, and video. By winter, Desmond had emergency custody. By spring, full custody, with Rosalind allowed only supervised visits after completing a court-ordered program she never finished. Garrick's trial started in April. I sat in the same seat every day, in a suit I hadn't worn since my retirement dinner. Delphine took a separate plea in exchange for testifying against him, claiming on the stand she'd been too afraid to step in. The video made that claim mostly irrelevant. The jury took just under 2 hours, guilty on both counts. The judge told him that a grown man, 3 times a child's size, holding that child's face in the dirt, and then going back to his beer, was not just criminal, it was contemptible, and gave him 4 years with a 2-year mandatory minimum. He never looked at me once. Miles was waiting on the porch with Skiff when I got home. "He's going away a long time," I told him. "Long enough that by the time he's out, you'll be too tall for him to ever try that again." We went out to the tide pools that weekend, and he found his first live sea star, orange and stubborn, clinging to a rock. He held it like it might break. That photo's on my fridge now. In June, Rosalind showed up at my door, thinner, quieter, asking to say she was sorry. I let her get through it, that she'd grown up scared of Garrick too, that shrinking Desmond down had somehow made her feel like she was still keeping the peace at her own childhood table, the only kind of love she'd ever really learned. When she finished, I told her she wasn't owed my forgiveness, and she certainly wasn't owed Miles. If she wanted back into that boy's life, she'd earn it exactly the way the court laid out, one supervised visit at a time, and it might never fully come back. That part wasn't up to me either. At the bottom of the steps, she asked if I'd been behind the fraud investigation. I told her the truth was simpler than she thought. Garrick had been committing fraud for years, and eventually somebody with the right training noticed. I never mentioned the 2 phone calls I made to 2 old friends, asking what a concerned citizen ought to do with what he'd personally watched happen on a patio in broad daylight. Everything after that was just the system doing what it's built to do. Garrick took himself apart. I only made sure the right people were looking in his direction. That's the whole difference between revenge and justice. Revenge is something you keep for yourself. Justice is something you hand to the daylight and let it do its work. Revenge leaves a mark on you too. Justice only asks that you don't look away first. I'm 71. I still live off the coast road, still drive the same truck, still fix my own gutters. Miles is 11 now. He splits time between my place and Desmond's, but weekends are mine. For the tide pools, for skiff, for the shop out back where I'm teaching him to mend a fishing net. He sleeps through the night these days. He plays soccer, not the contact sport Garrick used to push, because he asked Desmond, and Desmond said yes. Some evenings, once Miles is asleep, Desmond and I sit out back and just listen to the water. Last fall he put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Dad, thank you. For all the years you never said anything, and for the day you finally did." I didn't say anything back. I just put my hand over his. People will look at you your whole life and decide who you are, by the truck you drive and how little you say at dinner. Let them. Let them be wrong about it. The ones who actually matter figure it out eventually, and the ones who never do were never going to matter anyway. I'm just the quiet man in the old Dodge. I'm also the man who made the call. If you made it this far, thank you for staying with me. Hit like if any of this landed somewhere real. Subscribe to Saltline Justice so the next one finds you. Tell me in the comments what coastline you grew up on, and tell me about the quiet one in your own family that nobody ever saw coming until it mattered. I'll be reading. Take care of each other out there, especially the small ones.